Hey, Aaron Rabinowitz here for RedGiantTV.com. In this episode of Red Giant TV, we're calling in my good friend Harry Frank, a truly talented freelance motion designer in Los Angeles, California, to show you how to create an awesome crowd scene with Trapcode Particular 2. While Harry is going to focus on just building a crowd, using Harry's methods, I put together this final motion graphics shot. As a bonus, Harry will also show you how to create a crowd shot with Trapcode Form, but with somewhat different results. By the way, the Jumbotron screens were made using a tutorial that you can find on my website, allbetsareoff.com, called Creating a Jumbotron Look. Stay tuned after the tutorial for some information on some great deals to help you in creating your crowd scene and for getting a great deal on Particular and Form. And now, my friends, I give you Harry Frank.
All right, first, create a new comp. I'm going to work in NTSC D1 square pixel composition. We'll call this the crowd scene. And the duration of 10 seconds should be just fine. I'm going to create a couple of dark gray solids. I'll just use these to sort of make a very primitive stage. 2000 by perhaps 500 pixels should be just fine. I am going to use dark gray instead of zero black. The reason I'm using dark gray is so that it will respond to After Effects lighting, whereas zero black will not. So I'll hit OK, make this a 3D layer, and I'm going to look at this from the left view. What I want to do is push my stage forward. Again, we're looking at this left view, so pushing it to the left is actually pushing it forward in Z-space. And then I'm just going to duplicate this. We'll rotate this on the x-axis to 90 degrees, and then tap the V key so we can get our selection tool and select this second piece and just move it in place like that. So we can't see it, but it's out here and it is going to be our stage. It's a very primitive stage for our scene and for our artists to stand upon. So let's jump back to the active camera view, and actually to get to the last camera view, we can just tap the escape key, and that'll get us back to our last view. Let's create a camera, layer a new camera. I'll use a 35mm preset. I can tap the C key so I can move my camera up just a little bit, and we can see that our stage looks a little bit flat. Like I said, I did want to add some lighting to this, so I'm going to go to Layer, New Light, add a point light, and I need to move it close to the stage. Let's jump back to that left view, so I can just tap Escape again to get to our last view, and we can see that the light is pretty far away from the stage. So I'm going to put this one light right over here about the corner, so it's going to hit the front and the top of it. Tap Escape again. And we can see where our light is. Let's move this over to the side. I'm going to duplicate it, and then we'll move it over to the other side here. So just so we add a little bit of lighting to the stage so we can actually see where it is and it's not going to look so flat. Perhaps I want to tap AA to get to the intensity and bump these up just a little bit. So next, I'm going to use Particular to fill this scene up with a crowd. So let's pull up Trapcode Particular, go to Layer, New Solid, call this Crowd dash Particular. Now I do want to make this the size of the comp. I do not want it 2000 by 500. So just click Make Comp Size. The color doesn't matter because that's just going to go away, and we're going to apply Effect down at the bottom here, Trapcode Particular. Now we have moved the camera a little bit, so let me bump this camera back just so we can see our default settings of Trapcode Particular here. What we want to have Particular do is emit particles in a flat, almost two-dimensional area. So I'm going to go to the emitter section here, and I'm going to change the emitter type from point, which emits particles from a infinitely small point, to a box. This will emit particles inside a box shape, and this box shape is defined down here. If I tap the tilde key, we can see that we've got emitter size X, Y, and Z. So if I move the X size out and the Z size out, we're going to get this sort of box shape that we're looking for. And I mentioned we kind of want this mostly one-dimensional. We really don't want much variation up and down. We want this crowd to be pretty flat on the ground. So I'm going to set this emitter size Y to 0. Now if I play through this, the particles are going to be moving and not exactly behaving the way a crowd should. So first, let's go to the velocity here. Velocity is at 100, which is its default setting. So I'm going to set that to 0. We're getting pretty close. We're just about getting the particle shape and behavior that we want. The one exception is that the lifespan of the particle isn't quite what we're looking for. First of all, when we start at frame 0, we don't have any particles. And then as we progress forward, we start to see particles as they are born or emitted from this box emitter. So what we want to do is go down to the emission extras. If you are used to Particular 1.5 or earlier, you are probably used to seeing this in an options box up at the top. We can set a value of a pre-run so that the particles are born this many seconds before the 0 mark. So if I set this pre-run to, let's say, 10, and I go to the particle section and make the lifespan of the particle something even longer than the duration of my comp, like 12 seconds. We're getting very close at this point. Although we've set the lifespan to 12 seconds, throughout the comp, the emitter is going to continue to emit particles because we haven't shut it off. The emitter is continuously emitting 100 particles per second. So what we need to do is set this to emit a lot of particles at the beginning. I'm going to set this to 1000 at the very first frame, frame 0. And I'm going to keyframe this. So click on the stopwatch, and then I'm going to jump forward 1 frame by hitting the page down key and hitting 0. So I've keyframed this over the course of 1 frame from 1000 particles to 0 particles. Now, because I've set the lifespan to 12 seconds, these particles are going to continue throughout this composition all the way to the very end. So now we need to think about replacing these particles with some crowd footage. So let's get the crowd shot set up. Now to assemble the comp that I'm going to use as the crowd particle, I've got a number of clips from the crowd control library from All Bets Are Off Productions, kindly supplied to me by Mr. R. Ron Rabinowitz. I've got a couple of musician clips in here, but I also have a number of clips of people dancing shot from behind. Got kind of a wide variety of people in here. So I'm going to select all of these dancer clips. Just hold the shift key down, select all of those, and I'm going to drag these down into the new comp. I'm going to make a single composition and hit OK. Now, as you can see, this library contains footage of all different resolutions. I was just experimenting with a couple of different resolutions here, so I do have some of these that are pretty large. So I'm going to scale this one down. Now, to position these, I'm just going to make these all 3D layers, not because they have to be 3D, but it just makes it easier to position these and add a little bit of sense of depth in terms of this person being in front of that person or whatever. So once I get her where I want it, I'm going to hit Command L to lock that layer, and now I can select this other dancer here. I'm going to move her forward. And once I'm happy with that, Command L, lock that into place. One thing I've noticed as I've been setting this shot up is shirts like a red shirt like that seem to really stand out and kind of draw attention to the fact that these things are being repeated. So I'm going to kind of obscure that red one. I want to darken these just a little bit. One thing I noticed when I was looking at reference photographs of crowd shots and rock concerts and all that kind of stuff was that, well, they're not lit like this. Most of the light comes from above or from the stage. So largely what you end up seeing is silhouettes with sort of a light edge around them as the intense light comes from above or from the front, or from the stage, I should say. So what I'm going to do is select all of these, and we'll pre-compose these so that they're all in one comp, because I want all of these in one spot where I can access their alpha channel. So I'm going to pre-compose these. We'll just call this the crowd pre-comp. I'm also going to rename this comp here to the crowd particle. It's easier to remember than the number string that way I had there before. Okay, so what I'm going to do is sort of a little bit of a light wrap trick that I've done. Everybody's got their own way of doing it. This is the way I've been doing it for a while. So I'm going to create a new solid. I'll make this the size of the composition that I'm working in right now, which is pretty small because these are just going to be the particles. And this can be pretty dark. Now, with this layer selected, I'm going to go to Channel, Set Matte. I'm going to use the matte from the crowd. Let's turn on the transparency here. And I'm going to invert that with transparency on the inside. Now I'm going to go to Blur, add a little bit of a blur to this, about 10 pixels. Let's set it to repeat the edge pixels. And I'm going to add Set Matte again. Effects work in a very progressive manner. This Set Matte filter is working on that black solid that I applied it to. This blur is then working on the image that it is seeing from the Set Matte filter. This Set Matte filter here is going to be working from the image that Fast Blur is applying to it. So it's very critical to understand that the order of your plugins makes a huge difference because one flows right into the other. So just because I'm using two versions of the same plugin doesn't mean they're going to be doing the same thing. And in fact, what I'm going to do is not invert this one. So do not check the invert matte filter. And we're going to use the alpha channel again of the crowd pre-comp. So essentially what we're doing is punching out the matte one way, inverted, blurring it, and then punching it out again, not inverted. And we end up with sort of a, well, on black, you're not going to see much. But this is very useful for using or creating light wraps. But in this case, what I'm going to do is use this black image here as a Luma matte. So I'm going to set this, or actually, I'm going to use this image as an alpha matte. So if I go down here and toggle this so I can get to my track mattes, I'm going to tell this crowd layer to use this layer's alpha channel. So what we end up with is sort of a haloed edge kind of effect of the crowd. And we can kind of control this a little bit with the amount of blurriness. So how much we're seeing of them. And in fact, we probably want to get rid of the bottom half. So I'm just going to mask this out so that we're just seeing the top half. And hit F to show the feathering, unlock these, and feather this just shy of 100 pixels. But now we just have the sort of haloed version of this. So I need another version of this crowd shot. I'll just duplicate that, put that at the bottom. Because I duplicated it from this, it does have the track matte settings that came with it. So I'm going to reset that track matte setting. And now I just need a very dark version of this. In fact, I'm just going to make it black. I'm going to fill this with black using generate fill, which defaults to a really ugly red color, and I'll set this to black. So now we've got sort of a silhouetted kind of edge lit crowd here. And we can, vary that in as much as you want. If you want, we could put yet one more version on top of all of this without the fill effect. And we can just blend that back in. So if you want it sort of dimly lit, we can kind of mix some of that original crowd back in. Very cool. So now that my crowd particle is created, I'm going to drop that crowd particle into my main comp here and turn it off. We don't need it on, we just need it to be there. And if I go into particular, I'm going to go into the particle settings here. In fact, let me close all this up. Particle properties, size, and all that, how they look, are all in the particle section. So I want to set the particle type to sprite. In previous versions of Particular, you might remember this as custom, and the texture of the sprite is going to use the layer crowd particle. Now it's going to give me a warning saying that the particle is a little bit big. That's just fine. We're using a large crowd shot, and if we do want the camera to pass closely to the crowd, we do need that crowd shot to be a little bit large. So I'm going to set the size to 100. Now we can see sort of this crowd shot going on in here. Now I can go into the emitter section here and raise the crowd up by bringing the Y position a little bit closer to 0. Let's use perhaps 100. Maybe 150. Now we just need to start adding a little more sense of realism in here. We're going to do this with some lighting effects using the new shading section in Particular 2.0. The shading section allows us, among other things, to use After Effects lights to light the particles. This has up until now been impossible. The particles in Particular have not responded to lights whatsoever. Now we can go into the shading section and turn on shading. However, right now I only have 2 lights in there and they're way up by the stage, so they're not anywhere near the crowd. So if I turn this on, everything is going to go dark right now. I do need to make sure that I have some lights that are actually near my particles. So I'm going to create a new light, and I need to position this where my crowd is. So I'm going to jump to a custom view here. Again, I've got caps lock on, and to move things along, I'm going to switch back on motion preview. Now, another cool thing with Particular 2.0 is the ability to use different views and render those views with your particles. This is a very cool feature. So I'm going to move this light just above the crowd. And I also want to make sure that it's actually positioned somewhat near the camera so it's not too far away. And I probably want a couple of these. So I'm going to select this light. I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm going to move this one back a little bit. So tap the escape key. Get back to our view here. This one's a little bit out of frame there. There we go. So now we just need to go into the shading section and turn on shading, and now we'll see our particles respond to the After Effects lights. Cool, now we can see that it's starting to look a little bit more realistic. Now we got some empty patches in here to sort of fill in, and we need to add just a couple more lights. So I'm going to fill this first frame in just a little bit more. If we go to the very first frame, I'll set this to 1500 particles. Go back to our active camera view here. I'm going to take these 2 lights, duplicate both of those, drag those 2 back a little closer to the camera. So we're going to fill this area in with lighting even more. Tap the escape key. I'm also going to turn on depth of field for the camera. Just tap AA to show the camera options and go and turn on that depth of field. And in the rendering section here, we'll notice that the depth of field is actually based on the camera settings by default. So we don't have to go in and turn it on for the camera as well as for particular. It'll be on if we turn it on for the camera. I'm going to take all of these lights and move them down even closer to the crowd. You'll notice that as lights get closer to the particles, they'll actually demonstrate fall off. So further away, the light will have less effect. And as they get closer to the particles, the light will have more effect. Next, I'm going to add just a little bit of smoke using Particular. Let's go to Layer, New, Solid, call this Smoke. And I'm going to solo this layer, go to Trapcode Particular. And I want to fill sort of the same area that I did with the crowd. So I'm going to do kind of the same thing. I want a box emitter, fairly large X and Z size. I'm going to turn the velocity down because I don't want it moving too quickly. Although what I am going to do is go into the physics section under the air section and add some wind in the X direction. I'm going to add just a little bit of turbulence. So I'm going to have the turbulence affect the position, which is this property right here. And from there, it's just a matter of tweaking the particle settings. So I just want to change. I'm going to have the opacity over life use this preset right here, so it just fades up and down. I'm going to set the particle type to cloudlet, turn up the size, turn the opacity down very low, down to something like 1%, and turn up the size random. Actually, 1% is still just a little bit too much. I'm going to turn the layer itself down in terms of the opacity. And from here, it's just a matter of adding some finishing touches. I'm going to add some curves to the crowd so I can darken it up just a little bit using a bit of a S curve here. And I'm going to warm it up, pushing the red up just a little bit. And I suppose we should actually have the crowd looking at something. So let's get back to where our stage is. In fact, I'm going to solo these two solids here. And I've got these two clips, at least, of a singer and a musician. So I'm going to drop these into my scene. Let's make them 3D layers. And of course, it looks like they're two different sizes, but that's easily fixable. Either that or he's just really tall. All right, let's move her onto the stage. And let's size him down. In fact, let's put the anchor point down at the bottom. Tap S to get to my scale, and I can just scale him down. Not quite sure these two would be in the same band, but hey, I'm the animator here, and I can do what I want. Now, my focus right now with the camera actually is more on the crowd. The artists themselves are a little bit out of focus. So it would be up for you to it'd be up to you to decide where your focus is. But I just wanted to drop those people up on the stage here just to make things seem a little more real. Now, you might be asking yourself, why not do this with Trapcode Form instead of Particular? That's a very good question. In fact, Trapcode Form would be entirely capable of doing this. And it would actually save us a few steps in terms of having the particles not emit on the first frame and having the particles not drift over time and all that. So I'm going to quickly set this up sort of as an addendum to our tutorial here. I'm going to turn off that crowd layer and let's make a new solid. I'll call this crowd form. And like before, I'm going to set up just the base particle shape and then we'll change it to the custom particles. So I'm going to go into Trapcode Form and let's take a look at our base form here. We want a similar shape, X and Z. We want them to be rather large. And I need to fill out how many particles I have. In fact, let me drag this just so you can see what's going on here. I want a lot of particles in X and Z. So I'm going to set this to maybe 30 in Z. Up and down in the Y, we just want the 1. And in X, I'll set this to 40 for now. So you can see we've got a pretty similar thing going on that we did before. And things aren't drifting. We don't have to adjust our velocity or emitter settings or anything like that because Trapcode Form doesn't have any emitter settings and there's no particle velocity. All the particles tend to stay put. Now, what we don't want is perfect grid shapes like this. So I'm going to go into the fractal field section here. And I'm going to have this fractal field, sort of a displacement field that, I don't know, it's there, but you don't see it. It's invisible. We only see what it does to the particles. So I can tell this fractal field to affect the size or whatever. I'm going to have it affect the position of the particles by displacing them. Now, by default, X, Y, and Z are linked. So I don't want these going up and down and all that. I want individual controls so I can have X and Z displaced in their position. So now we don't have such a perfect grid. We have sort of a random grid. Now, this is actually going to change over time because we've got a default flow evolution of 50. So I'm going to set that to 0. And there we go. We've got our base shape just like we did with Particular. So now I can go into the particle, set it to a custom particle. It's still called a custom particle, although I'm willing to guess in the near future you'll see this change to something else. But right now, the particle type is custom, and I'm going to define the custom layer as the crowd particle, just like I did before. And it's going to give me a warning that it's a little bit big, but that's fine. Now, the default size is 1. Let me set this to something like 30 so you can see where the particles are. They are indeed there. I'm going to keep sizing them up. There's a few default settings in Form that Particular does not have. Let's just set that size to 100. And one of those is a transfer mode that defaults to add. It looks great with organic shapes and backgrounds and stuff, but for a crowd, it doesn't work so well. So we need to set this transfer mode back to normal. And there we go. We got our crowd starting to take shape here. I can move the center up just a little bit. And just like with Particular, we can set a random loop setting here. So each particle is going to start from a random spot and a loop. Now, unfortunately, currently with Trapcode Form, we don't have the lighting options that we had before. But we do have things like depth of field that we can turn on. So I can tell it to render with a smooth depth of field, or you can have it match the box blur or squared off blur from the After Effects depth of field. I'm going to set this to smooth depth of field. So there you go, 2 ways to make a crowd using Trapcode Particular or using Trapcode Form. My name's Harry Frank. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks for watching.
Now that was awesome. Thanks, Harry. You know we're just wild about you, right? Maybe we'll even write a song about it. Maybe not. Now this tutorial was an expansion of a lesson found on the DVD Complete Training for Trapcode Particular 1.5, which you can find at the Red Giant Software third-party store. It's full of tons of good information, even for Particular 2 users. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, check out Harry's site at www.graymachine.com, where you can find a plethora of free tutorials and project files that will help you enhance your work. And while you're there, don't forget to visit the Gray Machine store for additional training, such as the highly popular After Effects Expressions training series, as well as 2 Trapcode Form training titles and several stock After Effects projects. Speaking of Trapcode Form, Harry also used Trapcode Form in this episode. The good news is that if you're upgrading to Particular 2, and I repeat, upgrading, you can get a great discount on Form if you buy the Particular 2 Ultimate Particle Upgrade Bundle. Go to redgiantsoftware.com and visit the Particular 2 upgrade page for more information. Finally, as Harry mentioned, the footage of the actors that he used to create his crowd came from Crowd Control, my company's library of pre-keyed alpha stock footage, which you can find at allbetsareoff.com. Harry used only 6 crowd control clips to create our crowd, and we want you to be able to do that too. So for the next week, you can get 50% off Crowd Control using the coupon code you're seeing on your screen. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for RedGiantTV.com. See you next time.